June 22nd, 1633. A 69-year-old man kneels before the Inquisition in Rome. He is old, worn, at the end of his rope. He knows exactly how this is going to play out. He has seen others, men younger than him, choose the fire rather than bend the truth. In his mind, he's done nothing wrong. He merely pointed his telescope at the heavens and wrote down what he saw. With one sentence, his life is destroyed.
We pronounce and declare that you, the said Galileo, have rendered yourself vehemently suspected of heresy.
His name was Galileo Galilei. His crime, explicitly saying that the earth turns around the sun. But to understand how he ended up on his knees before the Inquisition, we have to go back at the beginning, to a city that already knew a thing or two about mathematical disruption. Leonardo Fibonacci, though, is not the only scientist that this city ever produced. On the 15th of February 1564, in the Pink House, you see behind me Galileo Galilei was born. He would later be called the father of modern science, but in this moment, in 1564, he was just the eldest child, the eldest son of Vincenzo Galilei and Giulia Ammannati. Galileo came from two prominent bloodlines. His mother, Giulia, was from the Ammannati family, who had built a fortune in the lumber trade. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was from a noble Florentine family that had all the aristocratic prestige, but little money to spend. Vincenzo was a talented musician, but music wasn't going to pay the bills. Eventually, he had to face reality and take up commercial trading just to put food on the table. With this poverty in mind, when in 1581 it was time for Galileo to go to university, his father actually suggested a career in medicine because, yesterday like today, medicine did pay the bills. Like a good son, Galileo did enroll in medicine, but he barely showed up. He preferred to spend his time secretly eavesdropping on geometry lectures given by Ostilio Ricci, the mathematician for the powerful Medici court. Trading medicine for math eventually made him the father of modern science, but when his father died, leaving Galileo to scrounge up the cash for his sister's dowries, it sent him straight into debt. Maybe his father had been right all along. By 1592, despite a position as the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa, Galileo was making a dismal 60 crowns per year, maybe 5,000 euros in today's money. He was desperate for cash. So when an offer arrived from the Republic of Venice for a teaching position at the University of Padua that paid 3 times more than Pisa, he packed his bags and moved. For 17 years, this was Galileo's life. He taught, he tutored, he scraped by. He was in his mid-40s and still working himself to the bone just to stay ahead of his creditors. But then, in the summer of 1609, a rumor reached Venice that would change his life forever. A Dutch eyeglass maker had invented a toy, a tube with lenses that made distant objects appear 3 times closer. This was the first iteration of the Spyglass. People had already dismissed it as entertainment for children, but Galileo had seen something more. Without ever actually seeing the original device, he reverse-engineered the entire thing, and then he improved it, boosting the magnification from a mere 3 times to 8. And then he applied almost 20 years of side hustling experience and pitched it to the richest buyer he could find, the Republic of Venice. You might be asking, why did the Serenissima need a toy? They didn't, and they didn't get one. What Galileo was offering was a naval defense system. In August 1609, he took the Venetian Senate up to the Campanile of San Marco and proved this device could spot enemy ships hours before they were visible. Sold on this massive naval advantage, they doubled his salary and granted him life tenure. Even with his financial future secure, Galileo didn't rest. He went back to his workshop and pushed the magnification up to 20 times. And then, in the autumn of 1609, he stopped looking at the horizon and pointed his tube up at the night sky. First, he looked at the moon. For 2,000 years, the established scientific and religious consensus handed down from Aristotle himself was that all heavenly bodies were perfect, unblemished spheres. But this wasn't what Galileo was seeing through his telescope. Rather than an unblemished surface, the moon was covered in mountains, valleys, and deep craters, not that much different than Earth. That would have already been discovery enough, but Galileo wasn't done. In January 1610, he pointed his telescope at Jupiter. Looking through his newly upgraded lenses, he saw 4 tiny stars surrounding the giant. As he mapped their positions, he realized they were moving with Jupiter. At that time, such knowledge broke the fundamental rule of the universe, that everything revolved around the Earth. Over the years in Padua, Galileo had racked up quite the reputation. Genius, yes, but what a personality! He was blisteringly sarcastic, notoriously thin-skinned, and absolutely merciless to anyone trying to steal his thunder. Take his student Baldassare Capra, who published a manual claiming he had invented an innovative military compass. The problem? Galileo had already published a book detailing the exact same compass the year before. Galileo's reaction was explosive. He dragged Capra to court, got him expelled, and published a scathing pamphlet explicitly designed to destroy Capra's career and humiliate him in front of the entire academic world. Answers like this made Galileo far more enemies than friends. By 1610, Galileo finally had what he had been chasing for almost 20 years. A salary that covered his debts, life tenure, and the fierce protection of the Venetian Republic. But for a man with his ambition and his ego, it wasn't enough. What he wanted was uninterrupted time to research, grand titles, and total recognition. It was time for another hustle. And this time, the client was someone far more powerful than the Republic of Venice, the Medici family in Florence. A year before, Galileo had sold his spyglass to the Serenissima as an instrument of war. But now, he was about to sell the Medici something else. Cosmic fame. His discovery of the moons of Jupiter had given him the right to name them. Seeking a richer patron, he cleverly named them the Medicean Stars to flatter the Medici family. The strategy worked perfectly. The Grand Duke was so thrilled by the international fame of having moons named after his family that he immediately summoned Galileo to Florence with an exceptional salary, no teaching duty, and the fancy title of chief philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke. It was everything Galileo had ever wanted, and it probably blinded him to the reality. Yes, the University of Padua paid less and expected more, but it also offered an unbreakable shield against the Catholic Church and its Inquisition. And Galileo sorely needed that shield. He was a scientist, thoroughly convinced that not even the dogmatic Church could ignore the mathematical truth of the universe. His friends desperately tried to stop him, warning that in Florence he'd trade his Venetian protection for the mercy of court politics and the Vatican. But the most haunting warning came from his rival, the Aristotelian philosopher Cesare Cremonini. Despite their professional clashes, they were actually close friends. Hearing Galileo had left the safety of the Republic, Cremonini reportedly noted,
Messer Galileo would have done better not to get swept up in such whirligigs and abandon the freedom of Padua.
It was an ominous foreshadowing. But when Galileo arrived in Florence in September 1610, the dark warnings of his Venetian friends must have seemed almost comical. The Grand Duke Cosimo II had pulled out all the stops. Galileo was welcomed as a conquering hero. Banquets, praise, adulation. Nothing was too grand for the most famous intellectual in Europe. Galileo felt untouchable. Surely his friends' warnings had only been born out of jealousy. But among the glittering pageantry, Galileo didn't see the truth. At first, things seemed perfect, but Galileo had walked into a trap. An alliance of conservative clerics determined to ruin him. Their leader was Lodovico delle Colombe, so Galileo mockingly dubbed them the Pigeon League. But the humor masked the real threat. Unable to defeat him on the science, they shifted to theology, whispering that his work contradicted scripture. By 1613, the smear campaign had reached the Grand Duchess Dowager Christina. Galileo deflected, famously saying that
the Bible teaches how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go.
For the moment, he was safe. But his problems had only just begun. By writing his theological defense, Galileo handed the Pigeon League exactly the weapon they needed to bring the fight to Rome. In 1616, the Church officially investigated, declaring,
The idea that Earth moves is simply foolish and absurd.
Cosimo II shielded him, and he was given a private warning to stop teaching Copernicanism as an absolute truth. But in 1621, Cosimo II died. His successor, Ferdinand II, was a much weaker player. The Medici shield was about to shatter. Maybe if Galileo had heeded that warning, he would have been spared. But he wasn't about to refute truth for dogma. In 1632, he published the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Writing a controversial text that challenged the fundamental dogmas of the Catholic Church required diplomacy. Unfortunately, that word wasn't in Galileo's vocabulary. Instead, he leaned into the very trait that had made him so many enemies back in Padua, his blistering sarcasm. And that is Galileo's truly fatal miscalculation. The Pope at the time was Urban VIII. Before becoming Pope, he had actually been a friend and patron of Galileo. Urban VIII did allow the dialogue on one condition. Galileo had to put inside the Pope's argument that human reason couldn't grasp God's absolute truth. And Galileo did it. But he put the words into the mouth of the character Simplicio, the simpleton. For Urban VIII, it was a public betrayal. The Pope unleashed his full fury on the Medici and the city of Florence. Ferdinand II couldn't stop it. He abandoned Galileo to the long arm of the Roman Inquisition. The 1633 trial by the Roman Inquisition was the tragic climax of Galileo's life. Proof was presented. Torture, threatened, humiliation required. A pretty standard Inquisition trial. One made not to discover the truth, but to extract a confession and enforce orthodoxy. Until that moment, Galileo had stood his ground. Truth before dogma. But he was 69. His health was failing. He agreed to plead guilty. He confessed that his book had gone too far, hoping for a lenient sentence. But there was no leniency coming. Not for the man who had humiliated the Pope. Urban VIII wanted the full capitulation, and on June 22, 1633, wearing the white shirt of a penitent sinner, Galileo knelt before the cardinals and read the prepared recantation, cursing his own life's work. In the end, though, the Pope did find some mercy. Heresy was punished with fire. Galileo escaped with a house arrest. Anyone else would have taken the mercy and disappeared, but not Galileo Galilei. Officially, he was a defeated man, confined to his villa in Arcetri for the rest of his life. But unofficially, he was orchestrating the final and perhaps most successful hustle of his entire career. The invention of the Galileo myth. Despite the ban, he managed to write an entirely new masterpiece on physics and smuggled it out of Italy to be printed in the Netherlands. At the same time, he activated his networks, sending dozens of letters across Europe, painting himself as a persecuted martyr for the truth. But his true masterpiece was his own biography. Written by a loyal disciple, Vincenzo Viviani, it paints a highly sanitized, almost hagiographic account, which completely scrubbed away Galileo's abrasive, sarcastic personality, leaving behind only the unblemished hero of science. It worked so well that it spawned centuries of legendary anecdotes. Number 1. Eppur si muove. Legend has it that as he rose after recanting, Galileo muttered "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, implying the earth moved. Nothing but myth, written a century after the fact. Mumbling that into a room full of inquisitors would have only earned him a one-way ticket to the stake. Number 2. The deep, damp dungeon and the torture rack. Myth again. As a famous scholar and a friend of the Medici, Galileo was housed in a luxurious 3-room apartment inside the Holy Office, complete with his own servant and catered meals from the Florentine embassy. So, not quite a distressing situation he wanted to paint. Number 3. He was blinded as punishment. Also a myth. He did go completely blind in 1638, 5 years after the trial, but it was due to natural causes. Number 4. He was denied a proper burial. That is true. When Galileo died in 1642, his family planned a grand monument in the Basilica of Santa Croce. Pope Urban VIII, still bitter about his humiliation, forbade it, declaring it an insult to honor a condemned heretic. He was buried in a tiny obscure room. The grand tomb you see today wouldn't be built until nearly a century later. It is interesting to note that it took the Catholic Church no less than 359 years before it recognized Galileo Galilei's innocence. And it was Pope John Paul II that in 1981 ordered the creation of a pontifical commission that then debated for no less than 13 years before arriving to the conclusion that, and I quote, some errors in judgment were made. While the commission said that Galileo was innocent and the church might have been a little bit heavy-handed on the punishment, a sort of punishment was still needed because Galileo had presented a theory without the proper proof. It took over 3 centuries for the dust to finally settle on Galileo's legacy, but looking back at the city where his journey began, the distance between his time and ours suddenly feels much shorter. I'm actually very proud because I am part of the same history. Their University of Pisa is my University of Pisa.